Welcome everyone to our Expanded Access 101 panel with the Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access, also known as COOPR. The mission of COOPR is to advance research, policy, and education regarding the ethical issues surrounding access to investigational medical products to safeguard the fair and transparent treatment of all patients. COOPR includes representatives from healthcare, patient advocacy groups, industry, regulatory, legal, policy areas, bioethics, and academia. Before introductions, I want to remind you of a few things. First, there will be time for Q&A at the end, so please prepare your questions. You can submit questions anytime throughout the Q&A function on your screen. Second, we'll be posting links in chats throughout today's webinar, so please be sure to copy and paste any that interest you. Third, we will be recording this webinar and it will be available on COOPR's website or by email after the event. Fourth, there is a handout of expanded access resources that will be sent to attendees following today's event. It is my pleasure to be with you today. My name is Regine Nshimiyimana-Maniraho. I am a former pharmacist, currently practicing as an oncology nurse practitioner and an adjunct faculty at the Sydney Chemo Cancer Center at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. I am a member of COOPR and I will be moderating today's webinar. Today we will be covering a broad overview of what it means to access an approved medicine outside of clinical trials. This topic had lots of attention with treatments and vaccines for the COVID-19 pandemic. And we hope this overview of the subject will shed light on how to access and approve medicines outside clinical trial for the treatment of complex diseases unrelated to the pandemic. Most pharmaceutical products are unavailable to patients until the FDA approves them for marketing once they are shown to be safe and effective for their intended use. Although the preferred way for patients to access medical products before they are approved is via clinical trials, some patients who might benefit from unapproved drugs may not be able to join a clinical trial. This is why regulatory pathways exist for patients with serious diseases and no alternative treatment options to get an approved product outside clinical trials. Expanded access, right to try, and some cases, emergency use authorizations are all examples of regulatory pathways to access an approved product outside of a clinical trial. These pathways raise numerous legal, political, logistical, and ethical concerns, ranging from informed consent and patients who might not understand the risks to how fairly these unapproved products are shared among patients who might benefit, and how companies decide whether they can provide non-trial access to their investigational products. Patients with rare diseases have an even more difficult time finding effective treatments or clinical trial, and so access to unapproved drugs outside of clinical trials can play an important role in the community of patients with rare diseases. Today, we will hear from 4 panelists who all have expertise in non-trial pre-approval access and who also happen to be members of the Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access Working Group. They will address the process of getting access to an approved product, the ethical concerns, the political challenges, and the impact of these decisions on patients who are hoping to find a meaningful therapy in the face of uncertainty. Our time today is limited, so each presenter will provide their own brief introduction before they speak. With that, I will hand it over to our first presenter, Ms. Lisa Kearns.
Hi, thank you so much, Regine. I'm Lisa Kearns. I'm a senior research associate at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, Division of Medical Ethics, and a longtime member of CUPA. I've been studying compassionate use, expanded access, whatever you want to call it, for more than 8 years now. So as mentioned, this is going to be a very general introduction, but first, my colleague, Richard Klein, we're co-presenting the introduction portion here, is going to introduce himself.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. My name is Richard Klein. I spent the bulk of my career at the Food and Drug Administration. I worked extensively in expanded access policy and procedure and patient engagement issues at FDA. Currently, I am the Director of Expanded Access Programs and Policy at the GE2P2 Global Foundation.
Okay, so I'm going to get started. I'm kind of define the terms, which I always like to do at the beginning. Our topic today is investigational medical products, and those are medical products in development. They are under investigation that haven't been approved by a regulatory authority. And today I'm talking about the FDA. There are regulatory authorities all over the world. They're also called experimental drugs, experimental medicines, unapproved, pre-approval products, all sorts of names for them. And there are 3 ways that people can access investigational products. One is by clinical trials. There's also non-trial pre-approval access, which is known as compassionate use or expanded access here in this country, and will be the topic today. And then there's what we call emergency use authorization, or an EUA, which came to the forefront during the COVID pandemic. I've been looking at this for a long time and had never really heard of it until now. I'm not going to talk about it because EUAs are only issued during federally declared public health emergencies. But very quickly, clinical trials, as Regine mentioned, are the preferred ways to access investigational medical products. Trials are rigorously conducted studies to determine the safety and efficacy of drugs, and the goal is to get marketing approval from the FDA. But what if a patient cannot enroll in a clinical trial? The next slide, please, John. So there are 2 ways to access investigational medical products outside of clinical trials. There's the FDA Expanded Access Program, which is a decades-old program via which patients can access investigational medical products outside of trials. They're for single patients, intermediate and larger size groups, drugs, devices, biologics, any stage of development, and they have very strict informed consent requirements. Here are some of the other requirements for them. I don't need to read the whole list, but it's important that the patient have an immediately life-threatening serious disease or condition, and also that there's a favorable risk-benefit assessment, no satisfactory treatment alternative, and the patient is unable to enroll in a clinical trial, and use of a drug via the expanded access pathway will not interfere with the trials. Again, the goal of drug development is to get drugs on the market to help many, many patients. The process is the patient's physician identifies a promising drug in development and requests it from the company. And if, see that big if in red, the company agrees, the physician requests FDA sign-off and IRB approval. And IRB is an ethics body that looks out for the welfare of the patient during this process. The FDA allows 99% of requests to proceed. On the right, the Federal Right to Try Act of 2017, which was enacted in 2018, is similar in many ways, but we at CUPA believe it does strip out some important patient protections. Most seriously, it does not require oversight by the FDA or the IRB, and the informed informed consent requirements are not specified. They are not as strict as they are under expanded access. And the takeaway from this page is that expanded access is not the same as right to try. Richard's going to talk about some of the background and history of expanded access now.
Yeah, actually, expanded access has quite a rich history that reaches all the way back to the 1970s. There are a number of areas, particularly cardiovascular health, HIV and AIDS, and oncology, where expanded access really came into its own. But there was no official regulatory recognition until 1987, when the treatment IND and treatment protocol were codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. There was at that time some implicit recognition of treatment use for individuals, even though the regulation was for cohorts groups, but that has been expanded in 2009. A new subpart I explains the types of expanded access that are available for physicians and corporations sponsors. Next slide, please. So as Lisa mentioned, the track record at FDA is actually pretty good. It's more than 99% of requests that come into the agency are allowed to proceed. And I think it's that good because all those requests are already pre-vetted by the sponsor, who has to make the initial decision of whether they are able and willing to provide that product to the patients who are requesting them. And there are rare instances of denial of requests by FDA, and those are due to very significant safety issues, which are known or understood by the agency, or a lack of adequate information or data to presume that the use of that product would be safe. So essentially, those decisions are based on the weight of available data and evidence, the benefit-risk ratio, and for the most part, the agency is very, very flexible on those decisions. And I've seen situations where, even in preclinical situations, the agency has decided that the benefit-risk ratio for a particular patient was valid and allowed the request to move forward. Next slide, please, John. So there are certain requirements in the regulation that are shared by all types of expanded access in the United States. This is that the disease be serious or immediately life-threatening illness or condition, that there is no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy available for that patient, and that would include other clinical trials that they might be eligible to participate in. The potential benefit justifies the potential risks of the treatment, and that those risks are not unreasonable in the context of the underlying disease or condition that is being treated. And finally, as Lisa said, that providing the drug will not interfere with or compromise development for the expanded access use. And I wanted to make a special note that FDA rules do permit treatment access at any point during the medical product development, which is a difference from the right to try regulations. Next slide, please. So there are two categories of expanded access for individual patients in the United States, and these are based on urgency. So there is emergency use, which is a situation that requires a patient to be treated before a written submission can be made to FDA. So those requests can be submitted electronically, either by email, by telephone, or by fax. The paperwork does need to be submitted to FDA after the use, and that's usually required, well, that is required within 15 working days. There is no prospective IRB requirement in emergency cases, but the IRB of record must be informed that the treatment use took place within 5 days. This emergency use only applies in cases of individual patients, not cohorts. And it still requires that the patient be provided with informed consent unless they are otherwise exempt. And an example of that might be if the patient is unconscious, cognitively impaired, and there is no one else who is authorized to provide consent for that patient. So everything else is considered to be a non-emergency request. So emergency requests only are things that need acute, immediate treatment. So a fatal disease, which may result in mortality, is not considered an emergency unless it needs to be treated immediately. Next slide, please. So the FDA regulations do describe 3 distinct tiers of access. We're talking today about individual or single patient access, and that includes emergency use. There is also intermediate size population, which allows individual INDs to be combined into one patient population IND for smaller groups of people who might benefit. And usually this occurs at a time when more safety data is being accrued. And finally, there is the treatment IND or the treatment protocol, which is for large cohorts of patients. And there have been treatment INDs that have treated upwards of 30,000 patients. So it can be quite a large group. Next slide, please.
Okay, I'm going to talk about a really common myth that we hear in this topic, and that's the FDA is this huge obstacle to access. It's what sort of propelled the right to try movement. As we've heard a few times, that the agency allows 99% of expanded access requests to proceed, and that is single patient, and the numbers for the larger groups are close to that. They're not exactly the same. That information is also, the actual figures are on the FDA website. I did see a question about that. So in 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act was signed by President Obama, and it was a giant piece of legislation, more than 300 pages. And there was a little section on expanded access, and the law requires that companies with products in phase 2 or later of the clinical trial phases must make public and readily available their expanded access policies. That includes turnaround time, contact information, procedures for submitting requests, and also how the company's manufacturer sponsor evaluates requests and formulates its responses. These are really just requirements to treat the patients fairly and humanely and keep them informed. Unfortunately, as a paper late last year revealed, there's not great compliance with 21st Century Cures. Only about a third of applicable companies had the policies available as required, and these were oncology developers, and nobody finds a lot of reason to think that other developers of drugs for different diseases or conditions are in much greater compliance. Also, fewer than a third of the policies had all the required information. But I do want to say that the FDA has streamlined the process considerably in the past few years, and Richard's going to cover that now. Next slide.
Yeah, so FDA had been looking for ways of facilitating the pathway to expanded access, and what we ended up coming up with was a streamlined application for individual patient INDs. This is Form 3926. It's readily available on the web. It takes about 45 minutes to fill this out. It's a pretty slimmed down version of the original application. A second approach to facilitating the pathway was the waiver of full board IRB review that allows the committee chair or a designee on the committee to concur with the treatment use for an individual patient access, which considerably sped up the ability to get an IRB approval to move forward with the treatment. And thirdly, the agency created a new project for oncology use in single patients, which is called Project Facilitate. This is a pilot program, created a call center within the FDA Oncology Center for Excellence that creates a single point of contact to provide physicians and healthcare teams through the process to submit an expanded access request for patients who need oncology or cancer care. For other people outside of cancer, there is also an option of calling the Division of Drug Information within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or the Office of Patient Affairs for patients who have questions about expanded access. And I'll have links to those in the next slide. So in terms of facilitating the pathway, I think that knowledge is certainly power. And there's a wealth of information on the FDA website. You can just put into Google expanded access FDA. This site should come up. It's broken down to provide information for specific populations, being physicians, companies, patients, and families. It's got a lot of information that's organized, hopefully well, to allow people to really learn about what expanded access is, how to navigate the system, and how to get access when it's appropriate. And also, the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the Food and Drug Administration has an expanded access navigator. This contains a lot of the information that Lisa was talking about, where companies are required to post their expanded access programs. The other source would be the clinicaltrials.gov website, which can be searched for expanded access. And I think one of the big developments at the navigator is an expanded access e-request service. So it permits physicians to electronically request non-emergency use of medical products for single patients. It carries the physician through the entire process, helps you fill out the 3926 and submit it to FDA. I would also note right here that the only ones who can file an application with FDA for an expanded access would be the physician or the sponsor company. Next slide, please. So just mention this, but I wanted to highlight it because I think it's a really important asset and resource for physicians who are not very familiar with how to apply for single patient IND. This is the link within the Reagan-Udall Navigator. And once you get into it, it automatically takes you through the process. Next slide, please. And this was, as I was saying before, about Project Facilitate, specifically for oncology, but at the bottom, there is a link to the CDER Division of Drug Information, which can help patients, families, and physicians outside of the oncology arena. Next, please.
Great. Okay, I'm going to cover the ethical issue. Well, I'm going to cover very briefly the many ethical issues that surround expanded access. And this is what CUPA does. And there's lots of information on our website. And of course, any questions can be directed to any member of CUPA. But just the big ones I want to touch on very quickly. Informed consent. Now, the basis of informed consent is a risk-benefit assessment. And with expanded access, remember, we're talking about unapproved drugs, and we're talking about very sick patients who may have comorbidities, who may have had many lines of treatment. If they're cancer patients, they may have metastases. So there's not a lot of data on how and whether the drug will work. Obviously, there's more in later phases, but again, expanded access applies to even preclinical drugs or very early in the testing phase. And there may be no data on how a drug would affect this very sick, very special population of patients. Life-threatening illnesses can cloud consideration of risk, and patients may think anything is better than nothing, which is not the case, but the tolerance for risk goes up when depending on how severe an illness may be. A really important ethical concern is called therapeutic misconception, and that's the belief that an experimental drug will work. Now, it's experimental, it's unapproved, and they don't know if it's going to work, and they don't know, earlier on, they don't know if it's safe, but a patient who doesn't have treatment options may just have convinced him or herself that this has to work, this will work, even though it's experimental. All these kinds of consent issues, as you can imagine, are heightened in pediatric patients and really difficult for families making decisions about children. And another very important issue is equity. You must have a well-informed clinician to know about drugs in a pipeline and that they might be there to help a patient, they have, first of all, be aware of expanded access, and then they have to know how it works. And you heard Richard, and there's a real process. It's not difficult. And there are a lot of resources to help, but you still must know that. Patients and families must have time and resources, including financial resources, to pursue expanded access. And finally, we've seen politically savvy patients and families or well-connected get access that others are not able to do. And our industry perspective later, Ken Moch is going to talk a little bit more about that. That's my last word. Thank you all very much. Richard's gonna finish up here. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you. So following up on Lisa's point about therapeutic misconception, I just wanted to make a point that people do put a lot of trust in development of new drugs and that newer is better. I just wanted to highlight the fact that these are investigational drugs, and the reason they're being investigated is to see how well they work, if they work, and how safe they are. So I just highlighted a few of the, I guess, pretty tragic experiences that have occurred with clinical trials, and point out that overall, not very many drugs that go into phase 1 trials actually come out at the end as an approved product, either because they don't work as well as what's already available, or they have side effects or risks that just don't justify the benefits. And a relatively recent MIT study estimated that only about 10 to 15% of drugs that go into the drug development pipeline actually come out at the other end. And with that, I would like to pass it on to Jinsy Andrews, who's going to speak from the perspective of the treating physician. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And if the coordinator could undo my video so I could open it. Hopefully you guys can hear me. And I'll do my introductions. My name is Dr. Jinsy Andrews, and I'm the Associate Professor of Neurology and Director of Neuromuscular Clinical Trials at Columbia University. My background is that I am an ALS specialist, so I take care of people living with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also referred to in the US as Lou Gehrig's disease, and outside in other regions as motor neuron disease. I don't have slides because I wanted to provide my clinical perspective. I think this Richard gave a nice process view on all the different types of expanded access. And I wanted to provide a clinical perspective when dealing with diseases such as ALS, which are serious life-threatening conditions with very little in terms of treatment that's available. Now, one of the main things in the introductory portion of this webinar that you heard is that expanded access is a regulatory pathway. And so the first step in trying to have that conversation about expanded access, as a clinician, usually I will review the treatment landscape for particular conditions. So in ALS, we'll talk about what's available and what those risks are for those FDA approved medications and what the potential benefits are. And then after that initial conversation, we'll then decide to pursue investigational products through pre-approval access. And the most common way people do this is through clinical trials. And a specific issue, especially when it comes to ALS, is that a lot of people who live with the disease and come to a clinical specialty center are not necessarily eligible by the time they're diagnosed or by the time they get to the stage of having that discussion. And so the conversation about other options begin in that journey living with a serious life-threatening disease. And so that's when usually I will begin that conversation about expanded access. Now, one of the big things is that a person living with a serious life-threatening condition and their healthcare provider or physician will come to the conclusion that we should try to figure out a way to access an investigational product, but we have to approach the manufacturer and request permission to use it. So the availability of using something in an expanded access begins with the availability of the product from the manufacturer. Now, if that is available, I'll have to start a conversation about the risks and benefits. And so Lisa talked a little bit about informed consent, and it's talking about what we know about the investigational drug, what we don't know, and really laying out the foundation so that we try to minimize that issue of therapeutic misconception. Once we go through that process, I do have to put that application to the FDA if we're going to go through the route of expanded access. And the forms, as Richard highlighted, are streamlined. But one of the key things that I think goes unappreciated is when you're in a field that is dealing with serious life-threatening conditions like ALS, and it's a rare condition, especially in small populations of patients, there aren't that many clinicians, and the groups that do clinical trials or specialty care are small. So we have responsibilities in providing care to a large number of people. We are responsible for conducting clinical trials in addition to providing clinical care. And somehow we have to find time to put these applications in, and there is no dedicated staff or there's no dedicated time to do this. And so often it will pull on other resources. So as a clinician, if I have to do an application, I'll have to do the contact to the manufacturer and try to put the application in around all of the other responsibilities I have. And sometimes I'll have to pull the resources that are dedicated to actually recruiting and enrolling clinical trials to kind of get this accomplished. But once that application goes in, usually, as it was mentioned earlier, the FDA process, they usually do provide approval if the necessary documents and profile fits their review. And then I know this was a question also in the chat, but I'm at Columbia University. I have to put it through my local institutional review board, IRB. So not only do I have to get approval with the FDA, but I also have to get approval through the IRB. So most IRBs, like at our institution, we do have a dedicated review process for expanded access. So that can technically move quicker than a traditional process. But even if a drug was offered through a treatment protocol, like a large cohort for expanded access, I'd have to get a letter of authorization from the manufacturer, still have to do an FDA application if it's something that is not already approved under a treatment protocol by the manufacturer, but I still may need to still apply to my local IRB. And so those are additional steps that, again, I would have to find time to do outside of my regular responsibilities. Once that occurs, and if I get all the approvals, the drug comes to the site. And there are a couple of challenges here. So one is if it's an investigational product, most facilities or hospitals will have a research pharmacy and there are fees for storage. And usually there are no funds to support fees for storage of an investigational product if it's coming through expanded access. The other is if this experimental therapy or investigational product is administered through IV that requires a hospital facility use, or it's administered into the spinal fluid through a lumbar puncture, the procedure and the hospital use, the facility use for that procedure room sometimes are not covered. So this kind of limits my ability. So a drug might be available, it might be approved through the FDA and IRB, and then I have to get hospital coverage for the fees and costs for all of these additional procedures that would be required for hospital administered. Much easier if it's an orally administered or a drug that's administered at home. And the last is there is a reporting requirement. So although we can use expanded access to access the investigational product and it's outside of a clinical trial, if someone does have a safety event, if they have a bad reaction to the drug or land in the hospital because of the side effects of that drug, I still have reporting obligations. And again, it does require a little bit more work than just say prescribing a medication that's already FDA approved. But one of the most difficult things in this scenario, so I talked about the process, but there are, as a healthcare provider, I have to ensure that people are informed as best as possible about whatever investigational product we're trying to pursue. But secondly, I have to have some confidence that I'm not going to make the situation worse, so I have this ethical principle of do no harm. A lot of people living with serious life-threatening conditions like ALS will counter that and say, well, what is worse than dying? So I'm willing to take that risk. But that risk tolerance and that decision for when people invoke patient autonomy, that risk tolerance is different for every individual. So, for example, if someone is earlier in their disease and more independent and capable, maybe their threshold for doing something very risky is less than somebody who's more advanced and is willing to take a greater risk on an investigational product that we may know less about. So there's this constant struggle between those two principles. And the other, so I can just talk about the real life, and this will be the kind of the last bit that I'll talk about, is like the real life situation. So, personally, as a physician, I have access to a couple of programs for expanded access, but they are the drug is provided by the manufacturer, but there's no funding, right? So that it becomes difficult to find resources to complete all the steps that you need to complete in order to use the expanded access pathway. But second, sometimes the drug that's applied through EAP is limited. So meaning there's only a few numbers of patients that the manufacturer may be able to support for a variety of reasons, and especially in rare or small disease populations that are very serious and life-threatening. Smaller companies are in those space, so they may not have adequate drug supply to supply both in expanded access and clinical trials, or they might not have financial resources until the drug moves along further in clinical development. But that limited slots or spots for expanded access for particular investigational products really puts the clinician in the middle. And we have to, and I think as a community, we've been trying to figure out a better way to address the issue of equity and trying to make sure that we decide upon individuals for access in a way that's fair and equitable amongst people who desire that access. So I think those types of issues are some of the key components that I face as a clinician when I'm dealing with serious life-threatening conditions and considerations for expanded access to an investigational product to help treat a particular condition like ALS. And so I think I'll stop there because we do have lots of questions, but I just wanted to give an overview from my perspective as a clinician, and I think I'll conclude here and pass it on to the next panelist, Ken.
I think I should miraculously be on screen. I can't tell at this moment, but so hi, I'm Ken Moch. I am a serial entrepreneur in the biotech space. I've actually run expanded access programs in several companies. Start my video. Okay, now I can start my video. Now I should be on screen. So I've run expanded access programs in several companies, one of which was a company called Chimerix, which now about 8 years ago was the focal point of a rather intense social media public demand for access to one of our experimental medicines. That has led to my being actively involved in a variety of issues relating to expanded access and working with, I guess, being there at the formation of CUPA, having written a fair amount of articles with CUPA people, including Art Kaplan. For those of you who really like these things, there's an HBS case study now on my experience as the Chimerix CEO relating to this expanded access experience. So let me go into this from a different perspective. If you can go to the next slide, please. And this is a slide, basically just a small part of actually an op-ed I wrote in the Wall Street Journal about a year after this social media event at Chimerix. And it comes down to this statement, which is still true, I believe, to this day, which is that the decision about making an experimental medicine available under expanded access, that decision-making process in terms of yes or no, available or not, falls to the management of biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies. And part of the complexity here is to balance the near-term needs of any particular individual who's experiencing a life-threatening condition with the longer-term needs of making sure the drug is appropriately developed on a timely or in a timely basis for as broad a patient population as possible. So there's that balance, which Jinsy was just talking about in terms of how do you set priorities, and from the standpoint of making an unproven, still experimental medicine available, that decision primarily falls to corporate management. The way I look at this is, look, we're all in this business to make lives better and to save lives. Sometimes the question of whose life and how you do it becomes pretty paramount through this expanded access question. If you can go to the next slide. Trying to move through this moderately quickly so we have time for questions. And I note that there's a person named Z who wrote a question in the chat about what do you do if a company doesn't have their EAP program, expanded access program, available? How do we go to other sources to try and get the company to make it available? And I think that goes to this whole question, which is, how do companies make these decisions, and what are they thinking about when they make these decisions? So I happen to be in a particular situation where we had an expanded access program available. We had stopped that program. We had received hundreds of requests for the drug, which had been turned down by the medical department. And then a family wanted the drug and started the social media campaign. And frankly, everybody said, why don't you just give the kid the drug, including the FDA? And we said, if we say yes for that one person, be it for social media, for political reasons, I got called by senators, I got called by a billionaire. How do you say no to anybody else? And so how do you think through these questions is something that needs to be thought through. How do you, as Jinsy just referred to, if there are limited doses available, how do you make that decision? Coupa's spent a lot of time on that. Art Kaplan's written, and many people have, is a child's life more important than an older person's life? How do you make those decisions in terms of waiting? So it's not just we have it, we should make it available situation. There are a lot of near-term questions. And if you go to the next slide, there are some kind of longer-term questions, which is what happens if whatever you do slows down to develop the development program by a week, a month, or a year. It doesn't really matter, because those future people won't get the experimental medicine, hopefully approved medicine, in the time frame that they would have gotten it. So they're now facing the consequences of a near-term decision. And I think those are really important questions. The last one on this is, second to last, who's advocating for these future patients, needs to be thought through. And what I've seen over the past years is that many of the patient advocacy groups have gone through the process of, we want whatever experimental medicines we can get as quickly as possible, kind of stepping back and thinking, but gee, if we force something earlier and something goes wrong and it slows it down, what happens to our future patients with the same condition? So these thought processes really need to be considered. I happen to have been in this strange situation with Chimerix, where I think there's no doubt that the drug that we got to the little boy at the time of this event 8 years ago helped prolong his life by several years. But the drug ultimately failed in clinical trials. So the balance between those patients who were benefited and those who were not ruled against the drug ultimately. And as I think you all understand, sometimes medicines work for a portion of the population being tested, but not everybody. And so these are really important questions that need to be thought through in the pre-approval access situation. I happen to dislike the name compassionate use intensely, because if you don't do it, does that mean you're not compassionate? Or maybe you are compassionate, but you're thinking about future people in need. And so there are a set of criteria that need to be considered in all of these requests. And certainly that decision-making process for companies that I deal with and people I know who sit in the CEO chair think about these issues. I will say, with regards to right to try, and I've said this for several years, I don't know any CEO who would go around the FDA and ignore the FDA's guidelines to make their experimental medicine available, and would do so because they think they have a great drug and they just want to it's not getting it available quicker. There's something in the formula for going with right to try, which to me has always made me extraordinarily queasy. Would you want to take a drug that somebody is avoiding talking to the FDA about? It's not that difficult a process if you decide to do it right. And having done this in several companies and having been involved with hundreds of patients now going through the compassionate use pre-approval access process, it's not hard when you think it through. It's really the questions about how to do it and for whom that become the key issues, and when and what are the risks. So I leave you there, and I think we can open it up for questions.
Thank you very much for your attention, and to our panelists. For the sake of time, let's get right into the Q&A. And I think so many questions have been answered already, but let's continue. If there is any other questions, John, that I may be missing, let me know.
Choose one.
Ken, do you want to talk about like how, I think it's a good question, it was answered, but I think this actually is a really good question, is how do you not compromise the development of the drug so that we can get it approved and out there helping more people by giving expanded access? I mean, yeah, how do you make that assessment?
Well, you know, there's no absolute here. And so there are companies create a risk register, the things that can go wrong in their development process. And, you know, these are $100 million to multiple $100 million development efforts. And so everything you do has to be thought through in terms of risk benefit. And I happen to be a proponent, when you think it through correctly, of expanded access. That's why I've run several programs. I think it can be beneficial to patients in need. And frankly, companies can learn stuff about their experimental medicines. But you also have to think through the risks. And so there's no really clear answer. You know, if you about, well, it's absolutely clear we should make it available. There are no risks, because there are always risks. I think the later you are in the development process, the easier it is to say, yes, we can take this risk. When you're post phase 3 and you've seen the drug has activity, you know what the side effect profile looks like, it's a much cleaner moment, if you will. But what we're seeing now is people doing phase 1s as expanded access, or very early phase 2s when little is known about their experimental medicine. And certainly, and a number of folks at Coupa, and I've been part of this, have written about gene therapy and expanded access, where, you know, this is you do your shot and you've changed a person. And so these are questions that really need to be balanced. And Lisa, it's a really good question. There's no absolute is the real answer.
I'm not trying to take over here, but I on that topic, I'm asking questions that I hear a lot over this time. And so that's what, and I know a lot are answered here, but I wanted to ask Jinsy, do you have patients who demand access and you don't think it's the right thing to do? I mean, I think the real tension that we all see in all these different stakeholder perspectives are patients who have no other options, who really are trying to save their lives or save their quality of life. And we know that there are cases where it would be worse to have the drug. And I just want to see if you can speak to that, kind of put it in your perspective. And I know you touched on it, but just kind of make some sense of that. Because if we all think of ourselves in the patient spot, we're going to be, I know all the ethical issues, but I'm going to be demanding that too.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as a person who comes face to face with people who are dying, it is a very challenging position. And it is difficult to stay unbiased and impartial, you know, when you actually see the person, their family, or their friends right in front of you. But I try very hard to ensure a couple of things. One is one thing I do want to clarify is that, you know, I hear often in social media, all the people who want access, and I do certainly have people who demand access because the therapies that are out there for ALS are not good enough. They're not cures. They don't reverse their condition, right? So they want more. And especially if they've already tried it and it doesn't seem to be doing much and they continue to progress and they're not clinical trial eligible, it is a desperate position for someone living with a serious life-threatening disease to be in with no other option. But there are a few less vocal individuals that are aware of some of the risks and know that they might have big, some investigation products might have risk and they're not willing to do it. So it's not, I've learned and talking to individuals one-on-one that not everybody demands access, right? So that's where I really got a true tough lesson on, really listening to people and their individual thresholds for taking risk. That's number one. Two, if I have somebody who's demanding access to an investigational therapy, I will look very hard, and sometimes it requires me looking outside of my institution into other regions and other centers or collaborators to see if there's anything that's available under clinical trials. But if that's not the case, and they're asking me for something, there are instances where people will ask me for drugs that have not undergone any clinical development at all, or are phase 1 and have really scientific rationale that would not fit their particular condition, or that they might be, there might be serious, very serious consequences and side effects. And I want them to understand what they're asking for. So for example, there is an investigational therapy that requires a surgical procedure and implantation to the brain. And it's phase 1 in people living with ALS, but it carries high risk. And so I want people to understand that. So sometimes I will take the moment to say that this might not be a good fit. Can we look for another alternative? But, in doing that, it does kind of force me almost to find another alternative for them, So it is true that there are scenarios where people will ask me for a specific product. I might provide the pros and cons to it and steer them away from it. But it still forces me into a situation where I have to find another alternative, to be truthful.
Yeah, Lisa, to add to that, you're talking, Jinsy, you live in individual dynamics to a large extent. You're one-on-one with the patient. And there's also the issue of population dynamics, which is where the companies tend to live. As an individual, as a parent, as a spouse, as a child, each one of us would want to get the best treatment and the most advanced treatment and the newest treatment for a loved one in need. Let's just take that as a given on an individual basis, and as a physician, obviously. And I think it's not unfair to say that every person I've dealt with, and me as a CEO, we want to get new treatments to patients as quickly as possible. On a population basis, we have an issue that has to be dealt with, which is you may be able to talk to people rationally about here's what might work and here's what won't work. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of physicians sitting in similar chairs to you getting asked the question. And frankly, part of what I've lived with is physicians who say, I'm not getting between you. Go right to the company, see what you can do. Call your congressman, call your friend, the billionaire. And so those limits, you almost, to an extent, I view it as there are people who are trying to be rational and thoughtful, but there are others who aren't, and they're the ones who blaze through and create more difficulties for this whole system. And so that has to be thought through. That's why I kind of list out the complexities and say who's thinking about the future patients. You're trying to, but not everybody does, is the issue.
Follow up really quickly on that. My experience at FDA has also been that family members often push for expanded access, leaving no stone unturned when the patient themselves are really not that interested in taking those risks. And I think that's another thing to be considered. Is it the patient or is it merely the family?
I wanted to just quickly dispatch with a question about real world evidence, which is becoming more and more prominent a discussion in expanded access. The working group has a subgroup on ethics and real world evidence. That information is on our website, and there are a lot of webinars about that. And you have questions, you can write to any member of us or them. But Richard, I wanted to ask you to clarify, because this is in the chat. I think it's just so important. And I also just kind of struggle with it too. Emergency expanded access and regular. Now, regular is for people with no alternatives, can't get into trial, life-threatening disease. So why isn't everything an emergency? And this was really interesting during COVID, because the numbers for requests the FDA put out were just ballooned last year due to COVID, and the large majority were emergency requests. So
right, yeah. So there are people who would consider any serious and life-threatening disease an emergency. So the agency has a pathway. The turnaround is reasonably quick, but it's important to get the information that what is the rationale the physician wants to apply to getting this access? Why do they think this is a good idea for this patient? And those things need to be reviewed. Those things, should be judged in terms of how much data is available to support their use. And I think that's an issue with the company as well. And of course, the safety. But there are situations where you have an emergency that needs immediate treatment. And so I think of stroke or heart attack where, minutes count. And in those situations, there's the emergency pathway that doesn't require a prospective application on paper. So basically, somebody calls up, they have a quick conversation with a reviewer at the review division and get an IND number. The company can ship the product or make it available at the institution. But for the most part, you're not in situations where you're counting hours or even minutes that are necessary for that treatment. And so that would be considered non-emergency.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Rich, there was a question in the chat that I think we can also conclude on, asking why would you submit a request as a non-emergency, knowing that you really need that treatment to the patients as emergency as possible.
Yeah, I guess it's really the same answer that, the agency has to review and judge this data. And so it's important to have that information submitted. Who is the patient? What is their problem? What other diseases or medications are they dealing with? Are there known contraindications for this type of therapy? Those sorts of questions are assessed at the agency when determining risk and possible benefit. But for the most part, a patient can wait a couple of days to begin that therapy, and that's the review period and the approval or allowance to go forward from the agency. And I think, the idea is that emergency is only for immediately necessary therapy to save someone's life.
Yeah, thank you very much for everyone, for our panelists, for all of you